when Swedish immigrant Lars Bergström suspended a 4 by 6 foot sheet of hammered tin at a precise 45-degree angle above his sleeping bunk in his Montana mountain cabin during the winter of 1884, his neighbors gathered outside to laugh at what they called the strangest contraption ever hung from frontier rafters. The metal sheet, polished to a mirror-like finish and suspended by iron chains, looked like something between a giant-looking glass and a misplaced roof panel. But what those neighbors saw as frontier foolishness would become one of the most effective passive heating innovations ever devised by a homesteader facing brutal mountain winters. And within 2 seasons, 11 families in the valley would quietly install their own versions. Lars had arrived in Montana territory 3 years earlier from the iron mining region of northern Sweden, where winter temperatures routinely plunged below zero and survival depended on extracting every possible unit of heat from scarce fuel. Unlike his American-born neighbors who had grown up in milder eastern climates before pushing west, Lars understood something fundamental about heat that most frontier families never considered. Heat doesn't just warm the air around you. It radiates outward in straight lines until it hits something solid, and when that something solid is the underside of your cabin roof 20 feet above your head, all that precious warmth simply pools uselessly against the rafters while you shiver in your blankets below. The problem was universal across the frontier. Every homesteader's cabin featured the same basic design: a cast iron wood stove positioned centrally for cooking and heating, a sleeping area typically in the coldest corner farthest from the stove, and a steeply pitched roof that sent all rising heat directly upward and away from the people trying to sleep. Families would stoke their stoves until the metal glowed red, burning through 4 or 5 logs every night, yet still wake to frost forming on the inside of their windows and their own breath visible in the morning air. Children slept 3 or 4 to a bed under piles of wool blankets and quilts, while parents took turns staying awake to feed the fire through the coldest hours. Lars watched his neighbors wage this nightly losing battle against physics for 2 winters. The Johnson family, whose cabin sat just a quarter-mile down the valley, burned through 8 full cords of split pine every winter. Nearly 40 hours of labor per cord, plus the risk and exertion of felling, bucking, splitting, and hauling. The Olsons, with 6 children crowded into their single-room structure, kept their stove burning so hot the stovepipe glowed orange, yet still the youngest child developed a persistent cough from sleeping in the cold corner farthest from the heat. Hampus, the conventional wisdom said there was nothing to be done except burn more wood, add more blankets, and endure until spring. But Lars had seen a different approach during his years in the Swedish mining camps. The bunkhouses there used sheet metal reflectors behind their stoves to prevent heat from escaping through the log walls, directing it instead back into the living space. If reflection could redirect horizontal heat, he reasoned, why couldn't it redirect vertical heat? The physics were identical: radiant heat travels in straight lines until it encounters a surface, and a reflective angled surface can redirect those rays just as a mirror redirects light. What he needed was a large enough metal surface, positioned at the right angle above his sleeping area, to catch the rising heat from his stove and bounce it downward onto his bed. Finding the materials proved easier than explaining his plan. The abandoned stamp mill 15 miles away had collapsed the previous spring, leaving several large sheets of tin roofing scattered among the wreckage. Lars spent 2 days hauling 4 of the largest sheets back to his cabin on an improvised sled, ignoring the curious questions from neighbors who saw him struggling with what looked like oversized metal quilts. Back at his cabin, he carefully flattened and cleaned the tin, then used a leather strop to polish the inner surface until it shone like a proper mirror. The physics demanded maximum reflectivity. A dull surface would absorb heat rather than redirect it. The installation required mathematical precision that his neighbors couldn't fathom. Lars calculated that a 45-degree angle would catch heating vertically from his centrally located stove and redirect it at approximately 45 degrees downward, focusing the concentrated warmth directly onto his sleeping bunk positioned along the north wall. He forged 4 eye bolts into the ceiling joists, calculating the chain length to maintain the exact angle regardless of the metal's thermal expansion and contraction. When he finally hoisted the metal sheet into position using a rope and pulley system he'd rigged through the rafters, the effect was visually startling: a massive angled mirror hanging over nearly half his cabin's interior space, low enough that he had to duck when walking beneath it. The neighbors' reactions ranged from bewilderment to outright mockery. Old Tom Richardson, who'd homesteaded in Montana since before the territory had a proper name, stood in Lars's doorway and declared it the damn foolishest thing I ever saw a man hang in his own house. Martha Johnson worried aloud that the contraption would fall during the night and kill poor Lars in his sleep. The Olsen boys started calling it the flying roof and made elaborate jokes about Lars trying to move his cabin indoors one piece at a time. Even the more sympathetic neighbors gently suggested that Lars might want to reconsider before winter visitors saw his peculiar decoration and spread stories about the strange Swede and his indoor metal ceiling. Lars endured the ridicule with typical Scandinavian stoicism and prepared for winter with quiet confidence. He knew the physics were sound. Heat radiates from a source, strikes a surface, and reflects at an angle equal to its approach. A fire radiates heat in all directions, meaning roughly 1/3 travels upward, 1/3 sideways, and 1/3 downward. Without the reflector, that upward third was completely wasted, warming nothing but the underside of roof shingles. With the reflector positioned correctly, that entire third would be redirected downward, effectively increasing the useful heat in his sleeping area by 50% without burning a single extra log. The first test came on a clear November night when temperatures dropped to 12 degrees above zero, cold enough to be uncomfortable but not yet the bone-breaking cold of deep winter. Lars loaded his stove with 3 medium logs at sundown, enough to burn steadily for about 4 hours, then retired to his bunk to read by lamplight while his neighbors were surely stoking their stoves for the second or third time of the evening. Within 30 minutes, he felt the change. The air immediately around his bed began to warm noticeably. But it wasn't the familiar diffuse warmth of heated air mixing throughout the cabin. This was something different. A gentle, penetrating warmth that seemed to press down from above like sunlight on a spring afternoon. When he held his hand up toward the metal sheet, he could feel the heat radiating downward in concentrated waves, as if the metal itself had become a second stove focused entirely on his sleeping area. The sensation was remarkable. His upper body, covered only by a single wool blanket, felt perfectly comfortable, while his feet extending beyond the reflector's shadow remained noticeably cooler. He conducted a more rigorous test by hanging 2 thermometers in his cabin, one directly beneath the metal reflector at bed height, and one in the far corner of the cabin where the reflector's effect couldn't reach. The results were dramatic and immediate. The thermometer beneath the reflector registered 67 degrees, while the far corner thermometer read only 52 degrees. Both were in the same room, heated by the same small fire, yet the focused radiant heat created a temperature difference of 15 degrees. More importantly, the corner thermometer matched almost exactly what his neighbors typically reported as their cabin temperatures, despite burning significantly larger fires. But the real vindication wouldn't come from comfortable November evenings. It would come from the brutal heart of winter, when the real test of any heating system arrived with winds that howled down from the continental divide and temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in less than an hour. Lars waited, kept detailed notes, and quietly prepared for the moment when his neighbors would finally understand what they'd been mocking. December brought the first serious cold snap. 10 days where daytime temperatures never rose above zero and nighttime lows plunged to 25 below. This was the weather that separated effective homesteads from failed experiments, that killed cattle standing in their barns and froze water buckets, solid inside heated cabins. This was when frontier families burned through 1/3 of their winter wood supply in a week and a half, when children slept fully dressed under every blanket the family owned, when morning meant chipping ice from the inside of windows just to see if the storm had passed. The Johnson family's routine during this cold snap became a grim testament to the inadequacy of conventional frontier heating. Tom Johnson rose every 2 hours throughout the night to feed their stove, stuffing it with logs until the metal creaked from thermal expansion. Even with this round, the clock stoking, their cabin temperature hovered between 48 and 52 degrees, just barely warm enough to prevent their water from freezing but far too cold for comfort. Martha Johnson kept the children huddled together in the center bed, piled under 6 quilts, with heated stones wrapped in cloth tucked around their feet. She later confided to a neighbor that she could see her breath inside the cabin until nearly noon each day. They burned through nearly 2 full cords of wood during those 10 days alone, more than 80 hours of labor equivalent, reduced to ash and smoke. The Olsons fared no better despite their larger stove and willingness to burn green wood that sputtered and sparked. Their 6 children took shifts sleeping, with 3 sleeping warm near the stove for 4 hours, while the other 3 waited their turn under inadequate blankets in the cold end of the cabin. Father Olson calculated he was burning a log every 40 minutes during the coldest nights. Unsustainable consumption that would leave them short before spring if the winter proved longer than average. The smallest child, 5-year-old Anna, developed chilblains on her toes from the constant cycle of insufficient warming and rapid cooling. Meanwhile, in Lars Bergström's cabin 300 yards up the valley, a very different scene played out. Each evening at sundown, Lars loaded his small stove with 4 logs. Not the massive rounds his neighbors used, but moderate pieces that would burn steadily rather than explosively. He didn't touch the stove again until morning. The fire burned down gradually through the night, sending heat upward as all fires do, But that rising heat didn't simply escape to the rafters. Instead, it struck the angled metal reflector suspended above Lars's sleeping area, and the laws of physics took over. The metal absorbed the radiant heat, warmed to approximately 140 degrees, and began radiating that warmth downward in a focused beam. The 45-degree angle meant the heat wasn't simply reflected straight back up. It was redirected at an angle that concentrated it specifically onto Lars's sleeping bunk. The effect created what modern engineers would call a thermal microclimate, a zone of concentrated warmth within the larger, cooler cabin. Lars slept comfortably under a single wool blanket, wearing only his long underwear, while the thermometer mounted to his headboard registered between 64 and 68 degrees throughout even the coldest nights. The fuel efficiency was equally remarkable. Those 4 evening logs, totaling perhaps 15 pounds of dry pine, lasted 7 to 8 hours, meaning Lars burned roughly 35 pounds of wood per night. The Johnsons, by contrast, burned approximately 90 pounds per night during the same period, yet Lars slept measurably warmer. The mathematics were inescapable. The reflector redirected roughly 1/3 of the stove's total heat output, the third that would otherwise rise uselessly upward, and concentrated it onto less than 1/4 of the cabin's floor space. The result was heat density 3 to 4 times greater than conventional heating, achieved without burning a single extra log. But there was another, subtler advantage that Lars hadn't anticipated. The metal reflector didn't just redirect heat downward, it also blocked the upward flow of warm air to the ceiling. This created a stable thermal layer in his sleeping area, preventing the constant convective mixing that plagued conventional cabins. In a typical cabin, warm air rises to the ceiling, cools against the cold roof, then sinks back down, creating a continuous circulation that distributes heat throughout the space, but also continuously loses warmth to the exterior walls and roof. Lars's reflector interrupted this circulation, trapping warm air below the metal sheet where it concentrated around his bed rather than dissipating throughout the cabin. The effect was similar to a bed canopy, but instead of fabric blocking drafts, this was metal blocking thermal escape. The true test came on January 11, 1885, a date Lars recorded in his journal with typical Scandinavian precision. A massive Arctic storm swept down from Canada, driving temperatures to 43 degrees below zero with winds that exceeded 50 miles per hour. The storm lasted 36 hours. It was the kind of weather that killed unprepared homesteaders, that collapsed poorly built structures under the weight of wind-driven snow, that tested every frontier survival strategy ever devised. The Johnsons burned their stove so aggressively that the stovepipe glowed red even in the chimney chase, yet their cabin temperature never exceeded 46 degrees. Water in a bucket placed 6 feet from the stove developed a skim of ice. Martha Johnson moved all the children onto the floor directly around the stove, where they huddled in blankets and tried to sleep in shifts while Father Johnson fed the fire every 30 minutes throughout the night. They burned through an entire cord of wood, half a week's normal consumption, in 36 hours. When the storm finally broke, Tom Johnson emerged from his cabin with frost, burned cheeks and a bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting a losing battle against physics. The Olsen family nearly ran out of wood entirely. Their consumption during the storm exceeded anything they'd anticipated, and by the second night Father Olsen was splitting furniture and hauling in the last of their green wood stockpile from the snow-buried shed. The children cried from cold despite every blanket and heated stone the family could provide. When the storm ended, Mother Olsen discovered that several of their precious glass jars of preserved vegetables had frozen and cracked despite being stored in the warmest corner of the cabin. The loss represented months of summer work and threatened their food security for the remainder of winter. Lars Bergström, by contrast, slept peacefully through both nights of the storm under his single wool blanket. His journal entry from January 12 noted a minimum sleeping area temperature of 61 degrees and a total wood consumption of 9 logs over 36 hours, roughly 60 pounds of fuel compared to the Johnsons' 300. He woke refreshed and maintained his normal routine, and even took the time to clear snow from his path to the woodshed in preparation for the next storm. The reflector above his bed radiated a steady, gentle warmth that required no tending, no anxiety, no exhausting overnight vigils feeding a desperate fire. The day after the storm broke, Tom Johnson appeared at Lars's door. The proud old homesteader stood in the threshold, snow caked on his beard, dark circles under his eyes from 2 nights without real sleep, and asked a single question: "Can you show me how you hung that metal sheet?" Within a week, 3 more families had visited. Lars invited each into his cabin during evening hours, demonstrated the comfortable warmth beneath the reflector, showed them the thermometer readings that proved the temperature difference, and most convincingly of all, showed them his modest woodpile, still more than half full despite being deep into winter, while his neighbors' piles had dwindled alarmingly. He explained the physics in simple terms: heat travels in straight lines, Metal reflects heat just as it reflects light, and a properly angled reflector redirects wasted upward heat down onto your sleeping area where it actually benefits you. The explanations were met with a mixture of chagrin and dawning understanding. These were practical people who understood leverage and mechanical advantage, who knew that a properly positioned fulcrum could multiply human strength, who'd watched water wheels translate falling water into rotational force. The reflector was simply another application of natural law, using the properties of radiant heat and reflective surfaces to redirect energy where it was needed rather than wasting it where it wasn't. By late February, 11 families in the valley had installed some version of Lars's reflector. The implementations varied based on available materials and individual cabin layouts. Tom Johnson used a large salvaged stove backsplash, polished until it gleamed, suspended above his family's main sleeping area. The Olsons stitched together several smaller tin sheets and backed them with wood frames for rigidity. The Petersons, who lived in a half dugout with a particularly low ceiling, hung their reflector at a steeper angle to account for the shorter vertical distance. But all followed the same basic principle: capture rising heat and redirect it downward onto sleeping areas. The results were universally positive. Families reported sleeping warmer while burning less wood. Children no longer needed to sleep 3 to a bed under impossible piles of blankets. Morning routines became less miserable without the need to immediately revive a dead fire just to make breakfast tolerable. Wood supplies stretched further, meaning less anxiety about running short before spring and less brutal labor splitting logs in the heart of winter. The innovation spread through practical demonstration rather than persuasion. Once neighbors saw the effect and measured the fuel savings, adoption became inevitable. Historical records from the Montana Territorial Land Office note the spread of this technique through settlers' letters and county reports. By 1887, the practice had reached homesteads throughout the Rocky Mountain territories. A settler's handbook published in 1889 included a brief section on radiant heat redirection using metal reflectors, acknowledging that the arrangement appears peculiar but produces measurable improvement in sleeping comfort and fuel economy. Some commercial suppliers began offering purpose-made reflector sheets with attached mounting hardware by the early 1890s, though most homesteaders continued to fabricate their own from salvaged materials. The physics behind Lars's innovation was simple but overlooked. A typical wood stove radiates heat equally in all directions, roughly 1/3 upward, 1/3 sideways, and 1/3 downward. In a cabin with a high ceiling, that upward third rises until it encounters the roof, where it's quickly lost through conduction to the cold exterior. Even with insulation, warm air against a cold roof bleeds heat constantly. The reflector intercepts that upward, traveling heat before it reaches the heat sink of the roof. The metal absorbs the radiant energy, heats to 120–150 degrees, and begins radiating that heat in all directions, including downward. The 45-degree angle is crucial. Too steep and the heat simply reflects back toward the ceiling at a different angle. Too shallow and the reflector must extend too far across the cabin to be practical. At 45 degrees, heat rising vertically from a centrally located stove reflects downward at 45 degrees from vertical, creating a cone of concentrated warmth that can be precisely aimed at a sleeping area by adjusting the reflector's position. The mathematics of reflection, angle of incidence equals angle of reflection, become a practical tool for frontier comfort. Modern off-grid builders and tiny house enthusiasts have rediscovered this technique, often unknowingly replicating Lars Bergström's century-old innovation. Contemporary versions use aluminum reflective insulation or even simple aluminum foil backed with cardboard, proving that the principle works regardless of the specific materials. Some modern wood stove manufacturers now offer optional heat shields that include angled reflector panels specifically designed to redirect ceiling-bound heat back into living spaces. The patent applications for these products occasionally reference traditional frontier heating techniques. Without knowing the specific story of a Swedish immigrant in Montana who refused to accept that half his stove's heat should be wasted warming his roof. The broader lesson extends beyond heating efficiency. Lars Bergström succeeded where his neighbors struggled, not because he had better materials, more resources, or superior craftsmanship. He succeeded because he understood the underlying principle, heat as radiant energy traveling in straight lines, and applied that understanding to solve a specific problem. His neighbors saw heat as a mysterious force that simply spread throughout a space, requiring more fuel to increase warmth. Lars saw heat as a predictable phenomenon governed by physics, meaning it could be controlled, directed, and optimized through simple mechanical means. This distinction between folk understanding and scientific understanding defined countless frontier innovations. The settlers who thrived weren't necessarily the strongest or most resourceful. They were often the ones who brought knowledge of fundamental principles and applied that knowledge to frontier conditions. Lars's mining background exposed him to industrial heat management techniques unknown to farmers and ranchers. When he encountered the same problem in a domestic setting, he had the conceptual tools to devise a solution. The story also illustrates the frontier tension between tradition and innovation. The conventional wisdom said you survived winter by burning lots of wood and enduring cold nights. Anyone who suggested a different approach faced immediate skepticism, particularly if that approach looked unusual or required unfamiliar construction. The metal reflector hanging from Lars's ceiling violated every aesthetic norm of frontier cabin interiors. It looked strange, took up visual space, and suggested its owner had peculiar ideas about decoration. Only the undeniable evidence of warmer nights and smaller woodpiles eventually overcame the social pressure to conform to conventional methods. By the spring of 1885, the joke about Lars's flying roof had quietly disappeared. When neighbors gathered for barn raisings or harvest cooperatives, conversations increasingly included discussions of reflector angles, chain mounting techniques, and the relative merits of tin versus copper for heat reflection. Tom Johnson, who'd been among the loudest mockers initially, became one of the technique's most enthusiastic advocates, explaining to new settlers that the Swede figured out something the rest of us were too stubborn to see. Martha Johnson mentioned in a letter to her sister back east that their winter wood consumption had dropped by nearly 40% after installing the reflector, freeing her husband to spend more time on other essential tasks rather than endless wood splitting. The innovation's spread followed typical patterns of frontier technology adoption. Early adopters were usually those who'd suffered most under the old system. Families with many children struggling to keep everyone warm, those with limited wood supplies, or anyone who'd experienced a near disaster during extreme cold. Once the technique proved successful for these pioneers, the broader community followed quickly, driven by the undeniable logic of sleeping warmer while working less. Within 5 years, the presence of a metal reflector above sleeping areas became so common in Rocky Mountain cabins that its absence seemed old-fashioned. Lars Bergström himself continued refining his design throughout the 1880s. Later versions used copper sheets for improved reflectivity, incorporated adjustable chain lengths to change the angle based on stove intensity, and even included small flanges to direct reflected heat towards specific areas. He never sought to patent or commercialize his innovation. Like most frontier improvements, it was shared freely through demonstration and discussion. His later journal entries occasionally mention visitors from distant valleys arriving specifically to examine his heating system, a quiet acknowledgement that his mockery, inspiring contraption had earned genuine respect. The historical significance extends beyond a single clever homestader solving a personal problem. The metal heat reflector represents a category of frontier innovation driven by applied physics rather than trial and error improvement. While many frontier techniques developed gradually through generations of refinement, Lars's reflector emerged from theoretical understanding translated directly into practical application. This pattern, educated immigrants bringing scientific principles to frontier problems, accelerated the development of the American West, introducing industrial techniques and engineering approaches to communities that had previously relied on agricultural tradition. Today, visitors to preserved frontier cabins occasionally encounter metal sheets mounted in ceilings and wonder about their purpose. Museum placards might explain them as heat reflectors, without elaborating on the elegant physics or the social journey from mockery to acceptance. The technique remains relevant wherever people heat with wood stoves, off-grid homesteads, wilderness cabins, even some contemporary tiny houses employ variations on Lars Bergström's design. The fundamental principle, capturing and redirecting wasted heat, remains valid regardless of era or technology level. For modern readers confronting rising energy costs and environmental concerns, the story offers a reminder that efficiency often matters more than intensity. Lars's neighbors tried to solve the cold problem by burning more wood, working harder, and accepting discomfort as inevitable. Lars solved it by understanding where heat was being wasted and preventing that waste through intelligent design. The 34-degree temperature difference beneath his reflector didn't come from a more powerful heat source. It came from using the existing heat more intelligently. Capes, the lesson resonates across contexts beyond frontier heating. When facing any problem where resources are limited, the solution often lies not in acquiring more resources, but in using existing resources more effectively. The frontier demanded this kind of thinking as a matter of survival. Modern life, with its own resource constraints and environmental pressures, increasingly demands the same approach. Lars Bergström's hanging metal sheet, once mocked as the strangest contraption on the frontier, stands as a testament to what becomes possible when you understand fundamental principles and have the courage to apply them despite social ridicule. The old-timers who survived frontier winters spoke of the experience with a mixture of pride and relief. They'd endured conditions that would have killed less determined people, proved they could survive through ingenuity and stubbornness, and built communities in places others had declared uninhabitable. But they also remembered the cold, the bone-deep, exhausting, dangerous cold that defined winter in high-altitude cabins heated by inadequate stoves. Those who adopted innovations like Lars's Reflector remembered slightly less suffering and considerably less fear, knowing that one clever application of basic physics had given them an edge in the endless struggle to stay warm. When Lars Bergström eventually sold his Montana cabin in 1892 to move into town as age and arthritis made homesteading impractical, the new owner specifically mentioned the metal heat catcher over the bed as a valuable feature worth preserving. The price he received included a premium specifically attributed to the heating system's efficiency. The contraption that neighbors had once openly mocked had become a selling point, a recognized improvement that increased property value. That metal sheet, probably salvaged from an abandoned mill and installed by a Swedish immigrant who refused to waste half his stove's heat warming his roof, hung in that cabin for at least another decade. It may still exist somewhere, perhaps corroded and forgotten in a collapsed homestead, perhaps preserved in a local historical society's collection, perhaps even still hanging in a cabin where its current owner has no idea of its history or significance. But its influence spread far beyond its physical presence, teaching hundreds of frontier families that the difference between suffering and comfort often comes down to understanding the simple physics of how heat moves through space. The stranger the idea appears, the more thoroughly it gets mocked, and the more dramatically it proves itself when tested by reality. These are the innovations that change how people live. Lars Bergström's hanging metal sheet might have looked ridiculous when he first hoisted it into his rafters, but it looked brilliant by spring when everyone else's woodpile was gone and his was still half full. Sometimes the most mocked ideas become the most copied solutions, and the man everyone calls foolish becomes the man everyone quietly imitates. That's not just frontier history. That's the history of every genuine innovation that solved a real problem, despite looking absurd to people who didn't yet understand what it was solving.